Good evening. A very warm
And
welcome
Ingrid.
to all of you in the audience. My name is Tamara Aberle. I'm the program and membership lead here at the British German Association, and we are very delighted to host this event tonight to celebrate LGBTQ plus History Month and also to have such a distinguished panel of speakers who I will introduce in just a moment. But first of all, I would like to take the opportunity to say thank you to the two organizations we are co-hosting this with. These are Women Plus in German Studies and the Association for German Studies in the UK and Ireland. And we have two representatives here from both of the organizations. And I would like to hand over to them first to say a few words. These are Christiane Schönfeld. She is the head of German Studies at Mary Immaculate College from the University of Limerick in Ireland. And she also chairs Women Plus in German Studies. And we have Professor Sascha Stollhans, who is Professor of Language Education and Linguistics at the University of Leeds. And he's also active in the Association for German Studies in Great Britain and Ireland. And now over to the two of you.
Thank you very much, Tamara. So on behalf of Women Plus in German Studies, obviously I'd like to warmly thank our speakers. First of all, Professor Matt Cook, Professor Helen Finch, and Dr. Anna Haikova for sharing their expertise tonight with us this evening. And I'm also very grateful to the Association for German Studies in Great Britain and Ireland, and Sascha in particular, for the collaboration, and also, of course, to you, Tamara, for the collaboration and for making the event possible. At Women Plus in German Studies, we're committed to fostering an inclusive and critically engaged scholarly community. And that really means attending to voices that have been marginalized, questioning structures of exclusion, and supporting research that brings hidden or suppressed histories into view. So tonight's presentations actually reflect those shared values perfectly, and exploring how queer lives have been recorded and erased and reclaimed in Britain and Germany. It's not only an academic exercise, it's part of a wider community, a wider commitment to inclusion and equality and dignity, recognition, and so on. So while the focus is on Britain and Germany this evening, I'm of course in Ireland, and I'm very mindful of the long history of queer lives in Ireland, and of the ways the church especially, but also the state, have often violently shaped and constrained those identities. So bringing such legacies into conversations is central to the kind of scholarly and civic communities we seek to build. So thank you all very much for enabling this event and for being here. And over to you, Sascha.
Thank you, Christiane. Good Abend, good evening, everyone. So I'm Sascha Stollhans. I'm the EDI officer for the Association for German Studies. And I just wanted to extend a very warm welcome to you all too. It's been a really, really great pleasure to support this really important event. And I mean, what a great lineup of speakers we have. I really look forward to it. Thank you to all our speakers. Thank you to our colleagues at the British German Association and at WIGS. And thank you to you all for tuning in. I look forward to hearing the discussion, and I do hope you enjoy the event. And I'm going to hand back to Tamara to introduce our speakers and start us off.
Yes, so thank you so much, Christiane and Sascha, for your words. And I will introduce the speakers. I just briefly wanted also to say, so if you have any questions during the discussion, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, or you can alternatively also raise your hand, and I will then pick this up at an opportune moment, and you can then ask the questions. So our great panel of speakers, this is I'm very pleased that they are with us tonight, and I first want to introduce Professor Matt Cook. He is an English social and cultural historian and specializing in LGBTQ and queer history, and he is currently the Jonathan Cooper Chair of the History of Sexuality at Mansfield College in Oxford. Professor Helen Finch is an academic who serves as a professor of German literature at the University of Leeds, and her her research focus is on the representation of the Holocaust in German language literature and queer identity and memory and issues of trauma and gender in cultural texts. And last but not least, we have Dr. Anna Haikova. She is a reader for modern European continental history at the University of Warwick. And her latest book, which was just published in 25, People Without History Are Dust, has won the really prestigious National Jewish Book Award in 26, shortly really before this event happened. And this is only the second time a UK academic won that prize. And probably, I think in all of its 75 years history, this is the first book with a queer topic. So congratulations, Anna. And I would like now to hand over to our speakers.
Thanks so much, Tamara, and thanks for inviting me. It's a really exciting event, and I'm really glad to be here. I wanted to just talk for a few minutes about the dance of visibility and invisibility, about secrecy and revelation post 1970, and suggest that these things have remained in different configurations central to understandings and experiences of being gay in the years since gay liberation in the UK. I want to suggest how resisting or sidestepping the call to visibility could sometimes make life easier, more livable, more pleasurable, in a period when openness was meant to be the answer. And I want to raise the question of what historians should do with this. So what should they do with this idea of things being in hiding and meant to be in hiding? And to anchor what I have to say, I want to take us to the south coast city of Plymouth and to one particular case there. So Plymouth, as some of you will know, is a relatively small, tight-knit and really quite remote city. There wasn't the relatively easy shuttling between cities that we get between Brighton and Manchester, Brighton and London, or Manchester and Leeds, for example. And Plymouth was characterised by tight workplace and family networks in the 1970s and 1980s, oriented around the docks and the Royal Navy, in which homosexuality was outlawed until the year 2000 for both men and women. So if the 1967 Sexual Offences Act was an important moment for many men in the UK, here in Plymouth, there were ongoing considerable risks and an imperative to discretion for those serving in the armed forces and their lovers and friends. And this was part of a broader culture of discretion and secrecy in the town. Nevertheless, Plymouth had a thriving queer subculture and a prolific casual sex scene, together with tacit knowledge about what was going on. I don't think it was much of a secret, and yet it was relatively unspoken. And there's plentiful evidence of accommodation of queerness, but also the will not to know. To the outsider, all this might be rather confusing and hard to detect. And all history interviews I did with 3 people who'd moved from Manchester to Plymouth for various reasons in the 1980s noted this cultural difference, where plentiful possibility and fun sat alongside a pervasive need to keep everything under the proverbial radar. There could, said one, be a pride in passing, rather than a pride in being out and visible, which was very much part of being gay in this period in Manchester and Brighton and other parts of the UK, for example. So several interviewees told me about a particular local concern with what the neighbours might think. So this idea of being observed or talked about was very much at the forefront of people's minds. So in this context, let me hone in on one particular interviewee, a guy called Dennis, who joined the Royal Navy in 1976 as a 17-year-old. He was firmly told at the start of his training that anyone queer should leave the room. He didn't see himself in that way, so on he went, and he was posted to Plymouth and to the submarine HMS Superb. He shared a room with 3 other recruits in barracks, and they became a kind of forces family of sorts. They would go out in the bars and clubs in the 1970s on Union Street, which was the road which linked the docks and the barracks to Plymouth city centre, and which were popular. These bars and clubs were popular with sailors on pub crawls into the town. And he told me there was a hive of activity on Union Street. Different pubs, different genders, different classes. In Diamond Lills, the people were a bit camp and a bit effeminate. Other places that we went into, there was always an element of it, if I look back. Not that I was aware of it then. It was fun, and you most probably accepted the innuendo or the banter that went on, or the touching, or the things that went on and were said. It was normally a case of a group of us going out. You go out together, you enjoy together, you're entertained, and you take it from there. You take it from there. There was, in places like Diamond Lills and other venues on Union Street, a considerable crossover and a loose sense of queerness. Dennis might flirt without coming out or necessarily feeling he had anything to come out about. And indeed, Dennis didn't then identify as gay, but he enjoyed the frisson and the comradeship that he found there. And in an interview in 2018, I found that his habit of discretion associated with the Navy and with Plymouth endured. So I was left hanging repeatedly, and it made me think about the voyeurism of oral history. I kept having to resist this urge to ask him to say what he meant when he said, "You take it from there." What was it that he took from there? And there was this accompanying sense that uncovering or revealing the truth would get us further in our historical understanding. And yet, perhaps it was precisely Dennis's deft navigation of secrecy and revelation, then in the 1970s and 80s, and in my interview with him, that tells us the most about his way of being in the Navy and in Plymouth, and indeed his way of being queer. In queer historical work, it's often the evasions, what we can't find or reveal, that might ironically reveal the most. I might ironically reveal the most about a life and the local and national cultures and contexts that surrounded it. The homosexual is most himself when he's least visible, Angeli Arondeka reminds us. Now, Dennis married and had kids, and on work trips, he would sometimes have sex with other men. Visiting Brighton in the 1980s, he noticed that, and I'm quoting, "You could be gay there," rather as if the identity was associated with the place. It was certainly not an identity he could align himself with at this point in Plymouth, and certainly not in the more strident, visible, sometimes camper Brightonian sense. His wife eventually found out that he was having sex outside marriage, and gossip spread around Plymouth. This was shortly after the year 2000 and decriminalisation in the armed forces, but Dennis nevertheless felt forced to come out to his colleagues and the recruits he was training, and then edged out of the forces by his superiors, who suggested to him that they were concerned about trainees, some of whom were 16, under the then age of consent of 18 for gay men, and also worried about the potential blackmail for military secrets. On both counts, his superiors were replaying very trenchant stereotypes, and replaying too the irony that maintains that homosexuals are apparently very good at keeping secrets about themselves, but when it comes to military service, could not be trusted and were a risk to national security. Dennis described in interview a shift in climate since that point, since 2000. But though he ostensibly welcomed the apparent liberalisation, the changes in the law and so on, he also seemed torn in what he said. He regretted the loss of what he had before he came out. He told me, "When I was a junior rating or naval trainee, I shared a cabin with three guys, and we had that community feeling of you look after one another. And I think that's lost now because everyone is an individual. They go back to their room and they shut the door. They just live on their own. The pubs, the bars on Union Street, they were probably frequented by sailors, be they gay, be they straight, or what have you, but it's gone. Recently, at the Swallow, which is the only gay bar left in Plymouth, where 95% of the people were LGBT, I didn't feel comfortable amidst people doing their own thing. Dennis communicates in this part of the interview a strong sense of a loss of the experience of homosocial camaraderie, which for him was tinged with homoeroticism. There was a clear potential in this kind of male bonding and in the lack of vocalization that accompanied it. He links individualism in the new naval culture with individualism on the gay scene, and tacitly too with the individualism and visibility associated with coming out and marking out a sexual identity. Neither naval nor gay culture would really accommodate him now or allow him to feel the comfort and fun he recounted from the 1970s and 1980s. As historians, we perhaps need to take note of Dennis's that Dennis's nostalgia is associated not only with his youth, but with being discreet, with enjoying twilight moments, as Anna Clark has it, rather than enjoying a luminous visibility and individualism. And we perhaps need to think too about how we ethically account for that. Should we try to reveal what exactly Dennis took from there on his nights out, or respect his will to keep something hidden from history and think about what that desire to hide might itself suggest? Okay, well, leave it there and hand over to Dylan. Thanks very much for listening, everyone.
Thank you so much, Natalie. That was really fascinating. And I suppose I want to start by saying that I feel that, well, thank you very much to obviously Tamara, Zasha and Christiana, but I also want to say that I feel I'm here under somewhat, somewhat queer pretenses because I'm not a historian, I'm a literary scholar. And I'm particularly interested in the way that literature, art, culture can open up aspects of histories, but also aspects of futurities that may be hard to access through other methods or that may supplement other methods. And I'm sure I share this with my fellow panelists because I think as scholars of queer histories, we're always interested in doing things queerly. But I guess my question is, are histories hidden because our methodologies create exclusive frames of knowing that we need to work on and to open up? Or is there something about queer experience, queer being in the world, queer histories that always elude fixed forms of knowing? So some of the terms that I'm going to be talking about today are ideas, for example, of transnationalism, of thinking of histories that traverse these national contexts of German and English. I'm interested in memory and the way that histories shift and change in memory and its communication. I'm interested in experience and embodiment and how these can be accessed through art and culture. So I'm going to talk about a project which is one that Anna has also been supporting, which is on queer experiences in the Holocaust. And I think one thing to say about this project is that it's been a communal effort. And I think that, again, is this collective aspect of tracing queer experiences come to many scholars of queer history and culture, that this is a collective effort and not one. I thought your emphasis on the individual there, that was very interesting as well, that it's queer scholars tend not necessarily to work as these rugged individuals either. So this project is interested in the emotions, memories, practices, desires, relationalities, imaginations during and after the Nazi regime. But this project is not trying to record queer identified people. We're instead trying to trace the heretofore obscured perceptions, opinions, and memories of those who participated in or witnessed queer behaviour during the Holocaust. So the shift from queer identity to queer behaviour is one not least that Anna has been instrumental in thinking about, but also my colleagues Jen Evans and others. I'm not trying to anachronistically ascribe queer identities, but engage with people's self-description, with their memories. And in this project, which is coming out at the moment as a special issue of Holocaust Studies, we included perspectives from different scholars, but also an artist as well, Matt Smith, exploring archives and memoirs, interviewing second-generation survivors about their own queer experiences, and creating images and ceramics to imagine the lives and traces of those persecuted. So I think exploring queer histories requires a range of methods and an interdisciplinary approach, not least to elude the fact that archives may often have been created by violence and by perpetrators. And in my contribution, I was particularly interested in how life writing and memoir can bring these hidden histories that traverse pre-existing categories to view. So I'm interested in the intersections between people who are persecuted for their ethnic identity and by the Nazis, principally Jews, but not only, and queer histories of the Holocaust, moving away from memory contests and that might see that some victims of the Nazis were viewed as more valid than others, or were competing for public attention from a normative culture, particularly in Germany, a post-war culture that wasn't inclined to give that much attention to victims in the first place, but that these memory contests could leave intersectional histories hidden. I'm interested in whose histories and stories get circulated, canonized and translated, and whose languish in oblivion trying to find an audience, and who does not get to write a memoir and publish it. And very often these are the people that you might expect to be less represented in queer histories. There are fewer memoirs by women, by trans subjects, by subjects writing in lesser understood languages. And here I'm going to admit my own linguistic deficits. I only speak a limited number of languages. There may well be memoirs languishing in Yiddish, in Ladino, and Hungarian, in languages that I do not speak. What I found interesting about the memoirs that I found of gay Jewish survivors of the Holocaust was that those that were published were all written by cis gay German men, but they were all subjects who had lived in exile, who'd settled elsewhere, who were plurilingual. So the ascription of German to Jewish subjects who may have been born in Germany and may have written in German is a bit queer, I suppose, because these were also people who had travelled. So I'm going to give an example of the memories of Harry Reimann, who astonishingly is a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust, who identifies as gay and is still alive. He published his memoirs in 2020. And his memoir shows how hard it is to pin down the nature of queer memory. So he asks, what does it mean to be a survivor? Does he count as a survivor? Because he escaped Nazi persecution as a small child and went into exile in America already in the 1930s. But as a survivor, the main duty he feels is to tell it as it is. So memoir can give voice to the way that histories can be hidden from its subjects. And again, I think, Matt, that the way that Dennis spoke about not necessarily seeing himself as queer is something that echoes in these memoirs. The way that memoir can show how people make sense of their personal queer history in the margins of received narratives, the way that memory becomes fallible, the way that language can help to create a reality, and the way that experience is traced on the body. So, for example, shortly after his 18th birthday, Reimann, who had spent the war in America, in New Jersey, was called up to the US Army. And he described himself as baffled by the questions levelled at him about his religion, his citizenship, homosexuality, yes or no. He says, the question shocked me. I didn't know what that meant. Should I say, no, Jewish? So the writing gay Jewish self here is poking fun at the limited vocabulary of his naive self in memory, suggesting that his ignorance of the word homosexuality prevents him from understanding his own queerness, from understanding his own queer history. So this is a history that's hidden to himself as well. But at the same time, the self-irony in this memoir draws attention to the structural homophobia of the US Army in the 1940s and the underlying stereotypes of Jewish gender trouble, which were active in the first half of the 20th century, not just in Germany, but elsewhere. Raimon has given testimony in many forms. He's created a film about his parents. He's written a novel. He's also a quilting artist, as well as writing a memoir. And the memoir also maps the aging process and the painful experiences of shame and grief at a lifetime of homophobia and a childhood marred in anti-Semitism that certainly continued after the war as well. And these emotions are also things, I think, which are accessible more through art forms and through memoir as a supplement to the archive. But queer histories are not always accessible to their subjects, or subjects do not always leave traces behind. And this is where the idea of imagining what can't be retrieved comes in. And this is where I think literature and art come into their own. So, for example, I want to turn to a novel by a German Jewish writer, Sascha Marianne Salzmann, Besides Myself, in 2017. So although it's written in German, it's mostly set in the Soviet Union and Turkey. And its protagonists and their lover decide to imagine queer histories that haven't gone recorded. So I'm going to quote from the novel, where the protagonist and their lover, who discover that they both come or have ancestors who come from the Ukrainian town of Odessa, they wish for ancestors like them, uncles who'd shave their legs and squeeze their bellies into corsages and dresses at night, aunts with shingled hair and black lipstick, strolling through the streets in suits. None of these stories had ever found its way into the annals of family history, but they must have existed. So what was wrong with inventing them? So this idea of literature as a space with these queer histories that could not find a space in the annal of family history, let alone of official history, can be imagined, is really important to my work. And I'm going to leave with a quote from an experimental novel, Blood Book, by Kim de Larazon, who's a Swiss author. And again, the Anglo-German, when we think about Anglo-German histories, we must remember that English and German are not only spoken in England and Germany, but in many other countries. Kim de Larazon is writing about autofiction and suggesting that a queer history might have to be a history of the future. They say perhaps this is what's inherently queer about autofiction, to start writing from a reality that repeats a fiction that we don't exist because we are still stories, because we aren't real bodies yet, that trans bodies have not yet found a place in history and have only found it in stories. So I'm going to leave that there.
Thank you, Tamara, for the very kind invite and the introduction. It's an honor to be speaking alongside Helen and Matt. And what I will do in the next 5 to 10 minutes is to give you a sneak preview into what is queer Holocaust history. And I will expand on Helen. Unlike Helen, I'm a historian, a very classical archival historian. And I also will disagree, hopefully fruitfully, with Matt about the questions of ethics. And how do we write about people who wouldn't have liked what we write about them? What is our job there? And then we can fight. You can listen to us. So what is queer Holocaust history? It is a victim-centered history in the call of Alexandra Garbarini and Kjell Friedlander. I look at Jews persecuted for their race, who engage in same-sex sexuality, sometimes consensually, sometimes out of coercion, or who were not so studied. The trans and queer experiences were not the reason why they were persecuted. It was, however, part of the experiences of the subjectivity during the Holocaust. Also, something that separates me away from Helen is I look at people who went to the concentration camps, ghettos, into hiding. I mostly look at history from October 41 until the liberation, simply because I'm a very classical Holocaust historian. I wrote my first book about the Theresienstadt ghetto. And with that, you already see, those of you, and I have looked, and we have many people who are colleagues, with that I'm very classical Jewish Holocaust historian, because I'm interested in the victims' experiences, and I'm not so interested in the reasons why these people were persecuted. A number of wonderful colleagues, Xavier Nunn, Matthew must know Xavier, Laurie Marhefer, Bodhi Ashton, and others have been looking at the reasons and the perspectives how the Nazis persecute lesbian people, gay people, lesbian women, trans people, and so on and so on. And this is super important scholarship. It will only be in 2 months that we will have a first English language book and the second book to date to come out about the persecution of lesbian women in Nazi Germany by Sam Hönecke, who is coming in 2 weeks' time to work. I'm going to host him. It will be wonderful. It's coming out with Toronto. But sometimes it can be very narrowing to just write the history of the Holocaust through the perspective of the perpetrators. It also raises some ethical responsibilities. And, I'm a granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. In a way, the perpetrator history does not interest me so much. Now, you could say, and how does it matter? Sure, there were some queer people in the camps, but how does it really help us expand the understanding of the Shoah? Now, the Shoah, and those of you who are interested in German politics and culture, you see it the very latest in the aftermath of 7th of October. The Holocaust can be extremely instrumentalized and be used in a very black and white light. That is not only the case in Germany, but I think here in today's setting, it is quite a useful example. Just this afternoon, I was reading about the latest shenanigans at the Berlinale, where I think they will be looking for a new director again, because she dared to speak about the war in Gaza, which is very shocking if you lead a new film festival. And by drawing our attention to people who were erased from history because they were seen as flawed, as deviant, as disgusting because of their sexuality or because of their transness, draws our attention to what histories were allowed to come into the canon of the Holocaust and who were kicked out. In a way, it's a very similar history that I'm writing to my colleague Ari Oskovic at Vanderbilt, who wrote a beautiful book about Porajmos, about the Holocaust of Sinti and Roma, and how little we know about it because it's only been told through the perspective of the Jewish survivors. So, in a way, it draws our attention to how little we know about the Holocaust, and that the Holocaust in itself, a history of a genocide, has been told from a history, from a point of view who gets to belong and who doesn't get to belong. Part of that erased history goes back to the homophobia in the camps. It is already in the camps where the victims deem certain sexual desire disgusting. And already in those few diaries that we have in the concentration camps and ghettos, they describe queerness as something that is deviant, that is terrifying, that is horrible, that is unhuman. This homophobia is not a continuation of pre-war homophobia. It is, as Kathy Gelbin, Uta Rautenbach, Inza Eschebach, and others have pointed out, it's in a way a human reaction to the strangeness and to the terror and to the fear of the camps. And being particularly conventional, even conservative about gender and sexuality is a way to come to terms with the fear, with the hunger, with the death and other things. So it's quite instructive to compare how people make sense of heterosexual sexual violence as something that is terrifying, but in a way understandable, and seemingly, or at least from what we see, consensual same-sex sexuality among fellow prisoners that is seen as terrifying and horrible. Now, how we narrate our stories, and Helen, you have touched on that beautifully, is always a social construction. So when your society tells you that you are disgusting, it's very difficult, only very few very strong people manage to do that, to claim that identity. And correspondingly, among the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, testimonies, all histories, memoirs, diaries that have been written since the war, we have very, very, very few promilles of people who survived the camps and speak in first person about engaging in self-chosen sexual desire. Colleagues such as Dorota Glowacka and Will Jones have started writing about male-male sexual violence. Even that topic has been really long stigmatized. But to talk not about queer sexual violence, but to talk about love and desire and pleasure is even harder. At the same time, we have quite a number of stories about heterosexual love and sexual pleasure in the ghettos and concentration camps. This is something that really dictated the field when I came to it in 2015, when building on Inza Eschebach. I thought, it will be fun. I will write a paper. And that was, the listeners, the rabbit hole into which I fell. And then I thought I need to make a clear table, and I wrote that book. One more reason why this is so hard is intersectionality. Yes, we have here people who are both Jewish and queer, who are both Holocaust victims or survivors, and who somehow engage in queerness. And especially coming out of genocide, people like to categorize, to see the messiness of two categories, of number of categories, kind of disturbs how people make sense of things and how they sort things out. And therefore, admitting both of the categories, even though none, queerness was not the reason why these people were persecuted. It was, however, the reason why they are missing in history, is something that is quite difficult to acknowledge. Now, Tamara, you asked us, and I decided to rise to the occasion to the difficulties of this history, but also current political repercussions. I touched on 7th of October, and I want to be very clear here. I by no means stand by the current politics of State of Israel. I'm horrified by the occupation, and I actually do consider the war in Gaza as a genocidal war. However, it still means that in the last 3 years, what we have seen is that Jewish queer topics basically have no home. That is for two reasons. Already since the 1970s, Jewish studies and Jewish history, and Matt, you have wonderful Jewish and Hebrew studies at Oxford. In fact, the other person in the UK who won the prize is your emeritus colleague, Martin Goodman. They still quite largely subscribe to the politics of respectability. It is difficult to write about Jewish liquor makers, about sex workers, and about queerness. That's only something that's starting to come forward, and it's not coming in the UK, it's coming from North America. So some of the most innovative studies about these marginal histories are not being conducted in the UK, even though we have some very, very innovative Jewish studies, not least in Oxford and in Leeds and elsewhere. And the flip side is the solidarization of queer communities after 7th of October with Gaza and with Palestine, which is wonderful politically. However, the flip side of that, and that is a little bit less fortunate, is an assumption that everything that is, however, Jewish coded would be seen as a betrayal on the Palestinian cause. Helen and I have been talking about it or commiserating in the last 3 years. People are often not even given the chance, which often, obviously, we should not be asked, how do we stand on Israel? Because the fact that we are Jewish does not mean that we have, a direct telephone line to Bibi Netanyahu, or that we are responsible for the acts of the State of Israel. But most of the queer workshops where my history, which, really on the face of it is a pretty radical history, would have been invited, people just don't respond to my emails. So with that, I really fall a little bit in the black hole, and it's just not me. It's also a number of other colleagues. And to be honest, I'm starting to be a little bit tired of it, because after all, I write this book in order to give hope to other young and not so young queer Jews, to queer people, to Jewish people, and for everyone. Now, this also plays out in the current political debates that Tamara also asked us to talk about, because one of the really puzzling chapters in my book looks at the particular case study of the library bans in the US that I'm afraid we will soon see in Europe as well, and how political activists from the right are going with fine comb through children's and teenage libraries that are state-sponsored and pick out all books that are seen as somehow controversial or pornographic. Dear listeners, these books are not pornographic. They discuss two male penguins who have a baby, the famous And Tango Makes Three, or the graphic adaptation of the Diary of Anne Frank, because Anne Frank is attracted to girls and she speaks about it quite explicitly in her diary. It was, however, only in the graphic adaptation where the penny dropped, because Antony Polonsky and Ari Folman in the adaptation, maybe because it was visual as opposed to in writing, that the penny dropped, but eventually it was even the original diary of Anne Frank, the quintessential Holocaust literature for teenagers and children that has been banned in parts of the US. So unless you buy Anne Frank's diary yourself before the age of 18, you will not be able to read it, say in the Escambia County of Florida. Now, I don't think we are at the stage where we can say they're Americans, they're crazy, because we clearly see the rise or the arrival of right-wing populism and fascism all over the world. The Czech Republic, which is my second home, had an election just in October, and we see Petr Matzinka going, the Czech foreign secretary, going to the States and discussing with the Heritage Foundation. So what I mean with all of that, I'm delighted that we have still the Queer History Month, that the three of us here are talking and discussing our work. But I think the legacy of queer studies, queer literature, and queer history it's something that everybody needs. No, it's not a topic for queer people and, being queer allies for a month. If we want to be militant Democrats, we need to pay attention to queer history and dare to be more queer. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the three of you. So I just wanted to remind the audience there haven't been any questions put in the Q&A box yet. So if you want to ask any questions to the three speakers, please put a question in the Q&A box, or you can alternatively also raise your hand here in as a on your it's also at the bottom of your screen, and I will put you in as a speaker. So maybe I don't know if you amongst each other have any questions or any points of discussion that you would like to ask between yourselves. Otherwise, I would have one question, if I may. Oh, there is a question actually just arrived. So Caroline May is asking, how do these hidden histories affect future memory? I guess that's a question that each of you could answer. Maybe I can start with Matt, who has spoken at the beginning, so he can, and then you, Anna, and Helen can come in if you like, if that's okay, Matt.
Yeah, what an interesting question and a really important one. And I think one of the things that I should have said that the story of Dennis came out of this collaborative, absolutely echoing what Helen said about the significance of collaboration in queer historical work, came out of a collaborative project called Queer Beyond London, where we worked on Brighton, Plymouth, Leeds, and Manchester. And what was really interesting actually was this, I suppose, thinking about these histories of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and how they were remembered in the future of the 2010s, and so therefore how they might be remembered going forward. And what was really, when I talked about the frustration of not knowing in Plymouth, it was partly because in Brighton, our interviews wanted to tell us everything. And so it was about what this telling or not telling did to our narratives about these places, and also the way in which those narratives get pressed forward. So the narrative continues in Plymouth about this reticence, and the narrative in Brighton continues, partly because of what we're able to tell, because of what people have told us. And I think when you mentioned ethics, Anna, and I don't actually have a strong ethical position on this, but I think it's a question, is, there's the question of what I want to know as a historian, or maybe as a nosy individual, versus what Dennis and others are prepared to tell me, and where our responsibility to push and hold back lies in those kind of interview contexts in particular. So I suppose this was a very complicated way of saying the ways in which histories are hidden or held back or mediated massively affects future memory. And I think the way to deal with that is to make those occlusions visible. In other words, so it's really clear what we can't know and what has been hidden. And that in the end is what I did with Dennis, is I said, this is what I don't know. And the not knowing is part of the story, is part of how we memorialize Plymouth, if you like, queer Plymouth.
I suppose I'll go next. Yeah, that was really fascinating. I think to pick up on what Matt said, but also what Anna said, memory is always political. Memory is always created in a society, in a structure of power. And in a sense, what is hidden and what is visible shifts in ways that are sometimes unaccountable and unexpected. And I think here at Leeds, I was at an event on queer archives as part of LGBTQ History Month, where we reflect on very much what you were saying, Matt, that projects that were initiated in the 2010s are now kind of slipping into a slight invisibility as we turn into this backlash period where we have a Renaissance fascism, and that the optimism about openness about queer histories that was there 10, 5 even years ago is now closing in. I'm going to put in a little plea, seeing we are being hosted by the Anglo-German Association Weeks and W+ in German Studies and the Association for German Studies, into the way that histories can be hidden by linguistic, the dearth of linguistic capacity. I've spoken myself about the fact that I only speak a couple of languages, but at least I do speak a couple of languages. And the number of times that we come across the idea that a history is hidden simply because it's written in another language is quite extraordinary, and I think is something that we need to battle. That's soft politics, I suppose. But I think the way in which hidden histories affect future memories is unpredictable in a way. I would love to think that the work that we do and the way that we mark, as you so beautifully put it, Matt, the occlusions of history and mark what we can't know will have an ethical impact on future memory. But memory has a way of taking turns in reaction to politics and power that is unpredictable.
Thank you. I just want to echo what you were saying, Helen. It's what memory has or doesn't have is not necessarily a good thing. It is a beast of its own. I still remember the olden book, Opa war kein Nazi, Grandfather was no Nazi, when the memory of the Germans around 2000 was that all of the grandparents were resistance fighters. They were not. They just kind of remembered that, because memory is a strange thing. Just like the British don't remember 19th century as an era of slavery and a class struggle. So what I would want from the work of all of us and our friend Jennifer Evans is that people make space for difficult histories, for ambivalent and failing heroes who are not only, doing amazing things from morning into the evening, and that we accommodate it, because if we want to draw inspiration in these extremely dark times, we need to also make space for failures. The cancel culture, the failing people for saying the wrong word is not going to help us in the next 10 or 20 years. I mean, as much as I don't enjoy some of the horrible slippages around Me Too and other things, people fail, they learn, they move on, and we need to learn to have a bit more grace with people messing up, because I've messed up, probably all of us have messed up. So much about memory, and what I've written about Friedrich Herrich, a Zionist leader who really inspired the children in Prague and then in Terezin, but also sexually harassed children. And I'm not condoning sexual harassment of children, is I think one such example. Met on ethics, it's I did not think so much about all histories, and I totally agree that when you interview people, they talk about what they want to talk about. If they don't want to talk about it, one only gets into hot water when you push them. But quite often it happens to me as a largely archival historian that I find things that quite contradict the narratives that people left behind. And I know, or the relatives tell me, that they are not extremely pleased by the history I'm doing. And here I think my responsibility is to write the best possible history that corresponds to this historiography, tells a good story, and also raises some interesting questions. My responsibility is not to make the people I write about happy. In fact, often the pictures or the narrative they left behind serves a story, but sorry for mansplaining you.
Can I jump back in, Tamar? I think what you're saying, Anna, is absolutely right, and really interesting, because I think if we think about who tries to cover queer histories, it's often family. And we tend to, I think, give too much credence to what families want. So, okay, the siblings, the nieces, the nephews, whatever, they say, oh no, I don't want the life of my aunt, my uncle, whatever, to be revealed because it's a stain on our family. When that person we don't know what their relationship with their family was like. And actually, their circle of friends may be a more appropriate place to think about an ethics of revelation, rather than the wishes of the family. Because I think if we're thinking about queer histories, then we also have to think about how we queer conventional lines of permission and ethics. So that's not about not having an ethics, but it's about queering it and thinking creatively about how we tackle some of these, which I'm sure we've all faced, the kind of pushback against what we're writing and the stories we're telling. So yeah.
Lovely. Thank you so much for answering this question in such detail. And we have here one comment. I just wanted to pass this on. Someone, Tara Tower Windsor, is saying she's also an academic. She's one of our trustees, actually. She's mentioning that she doesn't have any questions, but she thinks this is an absolutely brilliant discussion. So I just wanted to say this. And we have one more question again from Caroline May. And this is actually quite interesting. She's asking about the impact of language and how do you handle vocabulary and labels like queer, trans, gender fluid, etc., across time and language, and what do we, or what do you as academics and looking at this subject gain or lose by using contemporary labels for past lives? I don't know, maybe would you like to start, Anna or Helen, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, we have chairs of medieval history, and nobody in 1350 goes out and says, what a beautiful medieval morning. What is beautiful about the concept of queer is that it doesn't assume that people were aware or had any modern sexual identity, but that they engaged, as Laura Dawn and Jennifer Evans have called it, in acts and practices. And therefore, it's inclusive. Just like in 50 years' time, we will have new terms.
Yeah, I agree. I also think it's really important to pay attention to the language that people use to describe themselves, because that can often bring up strange and unexpected aspects of queer histories and queer practices that aren't necessarily accessible to us through our current or our local terminologies. But and I think it's also important, and this is something that I need to keep paying attention to remember that terms do not translate precisely across times nor across cultures. That the term schwul is not cognate with the term gay. They're used in very similar ways, but they're very different etymologies, and that we can learn so much from paying attention to this. But I think Caroline asked the question, what do we gain or lose by using contemporary labels for past lives? And I'd echo what Anna said. It's less about labels for past lives and more about describing experiences without trying to assimilate them to a current identity. And I also think that that also can help us push back against the other danger in hidden histories, which is their appropriation by what Jasmine Power has called homo-nationalist narratives. So just as it's dangerous to try and recuperate heroes from the past, it's also dangerous that these queer histories can be appropriated in the service of powerful interests which are not actually necessarily interested in looking after the queer community or in preserving the complexities of queer histories. So yeah.
I don't have much to add. I mean, I share what was implicit in the frustration of constantly having to justify our terms, which we don't find in other areas of history. So that's why. So I share that. I also think the emphasis on doing rather than being on is really helpful. Although that my caveat is that some people in the past held tight to identities, which we can in a by thinking through a queer lens, for example, as a paradigm, we can sometimes lose people's attachment to identity in the past, and so I think it's holding both, and actually taking our cue as Laura Doan would suggest and Jen Evans, from what people were doing and saying about themselves. And what the possibilities were around them at that time. And I think, to be honest, I think the most important thing right now is that we can communicate. So I'd rather use terms that actually have purchased now and gain a readership and spread some understanding about some of these issues and how they pivot into the present than tie myself in linguistic knots. I think communication at this particular moment is really, really key. So I suppose that's what I think about language at this minute. I might have said something quite different actually 10 years ago, but I think there's an urgency to queer history now, which feels very pressing.
Thank you. Yeah, we have like one more question which just came in the chat. Samantha Knapton is asking if you could talk a bit more about the use of queer memoirs as a historical source. So she came up against a lot more pushback and questioning using queer memoirs compared to non-queer ones. And she's asking whether this is because queer histories are seen as wrong and therefore not reliable, or is this from the get-go, or is it perhaps to do with that you have to do a lot more archival anchoring surrounding the memoir than looking for a non-queer memoir? Is this maybe Helen? Could you start perhaps?
Yes, I mean, I think this also speaks possibly to the somewhat old-fashioned quarrel between memory and history as well. The idea that memory and testimony are inherently unreliable in a way that archival evidence isn't. And I think that debate has been had in the last century. I get around this because I'm not an historian. I approach memoirs as cultural texts, and I'm interested in the way that they're constructed and the way in which they traverse emotion and experience, rather than trying to see them as an archive of historical facts. And Anna, I know you said something quite similar when you were talking about the memoir of Gad Beck that we were both been working on, that it's a different order of knowledge, possibly in some ways a queerer order of knowledge. But I ask different questions of them and they can teach us different things. Anna, do you want to possibly come in there?
I mean, I have a like crush on Gad Beck. I mean, he's a gay man, also he's dead, but I want to run away with him and have his children. He's amazing. I will say it differently. We see the queerness of queer memoirs, but the normal memoirs are very, very heterosexual. We are just trained not to see the heterosexuality. Matt, you will be probably speaking about it much more eloquently than myself. People who are minorities, if they write a good memoir, not everybody writes a good memoir, you cannot teach everything, some, that better than I, then bring all these layers to the table. Cecil Reichmann-Schmidt, a Roma woman who survived the so-called Zigeunerlager in Auschwitz, talks about surviving Auschwitz, but also talks about being a young woman of color who engages in sexual barter with the prisoner functionary. And Gad Beck talks about resistance and about being Jewish and about bartering sex, but also about having sex with men and about enjoying it and about all of those things. And it's wonderful for teaching. And I think the people who criticize you should pay attention and listen to your work.
Matt, would you also like to comment on this?
I mean, memoir is just. I mean, I use it all the time in my own work, but in my teaching, because there's an immediacy there, and it's really important. And I think it's a way. I suppose what I'd add is that in a way, this distinction between queer and normal memoir is itself kind of something to maybe, raise with your detractors, because it seems to me that what memoir does or often does is show us the intimate dance of queer and normal. So this queer memoir, the writer, the person writing this is going to have all sorts of investments in the prevailing norm, and the supposedly straight memoir will have its moments of queerness. I mean, inevitably. So I think these sharp divisions between what counts as queer and what counts as normal is something I'd want to kind of well, it's certainly something I try and get students to think about. How do we classify this in this way, especially if, as just looping back to the previous conversation, we're thinking that labels might not be that useful. So we're using a lens of queerness rather than and what people are doing, rather than how they're identifying themselves. And there's all sorts of memoirs. I mean, Sharon Marcus does this beautifully, showing how, women's intimacy with each other emerges, women's friendship emerges, through their life writing and letters and so on. And you could say, well, these are just middle class ordinary women, but they're also deeply queer women, in terms of the way in which they're deploying romance and ideas of love with their female friends. So I think it's partly about kind of trying to loosen up some of these divisions, between queer and normal. And that's a way, just to return to something Anna said earlier, of also pushing back against the current political, strategy of dividing and separating and saying, these are the terrible queers or the terrible refugees because actually, as soon as you start looking at lives in detail, you see how embroiled and entangled lives are with all sorts of other lives which are very dissimilar from the life described in the memoir. And I think if you can show that historically, you can also suggest it in the present and show how ridiculous it is to start dividing people off according to one, particular label or identification.
Yes, thank you so much. And with that, I think we come to the end of this event. I just wanted to say thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your really fascinating insights on this topic. And yeah, I hope you are having a good evening. And thank you also to everyone at home who joined this evening. And yes, have a good night.
Thank you, Tamara, Helen,
Bye.
and Sasha. It's been great. Really, really interesting conversation. Thank you all.
Thank you all.